Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke. drum-tec released a whole load of new electronic drum products a while back, spanning from expensive to budget options, and for the first time they're now also offering their own trigger systems known as the GrooveBar and the GrooveDot. They were kind enough to send me 2 GrooveBars, 2 GrooveDots, a set of real feel mesh heads, and a bass drum patch. So today I'm taking a look at the GrooveBar triggers, and as always, full disclosure, yes, they sent these to me, but this is a review video with pros and cons from my experience with the triggers, and there's no input from drum-tec themselves. So the GrooveBar is the more expensive of the 2 triggers, and there are 3 versions. A short and a long version depending on the size of your drum, along with a snare version which is essentially the long bar with an extra set of brackets to accommodate different lug screw patterns. I was sent the long version and the snare version since I told them that I was using a 13-inch snare and a 14-inch tom. The box is nicely presented, and inside you get the trigger itself, a bag containing the jack connector, a plastic clip, an Allen key, and a small wrench for installation, 1 set of brackets for the standard long version or 2 sets for the snare version, and a small slip with a QR code that takes you to a digital manual. I do think that it would have been useful to have the model labelled on the box itself. At first I presumed there was a set of brackets missing from one of them until I double checked the website. It's not a huge issue, but a little bit of extra clarity never hurts. The build quality is good. It's an all metal construction save for some plastic on the bottom section covering the jack connector, and a small plastic platform on each of the longer snare mounting brackets. The output jack is an 1/8 inch or 3.5mm socket, which then connects to an 1/8 to 1/4 inch cable extender, and that's where you plug your trigger's jack cable into. The mini jack can fit through the majority of portholes really easily, and then the large jack connector can be attached externally on a single lug with the plastic clip provided. The external mounting is great for a non-destructive installation and removal process. I also really like the mini jack connection approach. My 13-inch drum already has a barrel jack fitted with a mini jack connector from another trigger, so I could easily connect the GrooveBar up and get that going. The bar itself is also quite adjustable. The long version should fit across the centre of drums between 13 and 16 inches in diameter, and the tools provided with the trigger should cover the majority of adjustments necessary for this. The brackets provided will require you to remove some lug screws, and how many will depend on the hole spacing of your lugs. Unfortunately, the slot in the bracket is quite narrow. It'll accommodate M4 screws, which are 4mm, but it won't take 5mm or M5 screws. This seems like a bit of an oversight because there isn't really much standardization for lug screw sizes, so I think drum-tec need to consider making these brackets a bit wider to accommodate larger screws, because they clearly want these to be universal. Fortunately, that would be really easy for them to do because they're a removable part. You can then also adjust the height of the trigger cone platform using a combination of the thumb screws and Allen key bolts. You can also choose where to position these triggers based on your needs. For the 13-inch snare, I wanted to test positional sensing, so I mounted the bar directly across the drum with the trigger dead center. For the 14-inch drum, I started with it mounted slightly off-center instead. I did go on to test it in the center with my TD-50X, and I'll get to that later. So they're clearly aiming to allow people to install these triggers in a wide number of configurations for different uses, but how do they perform on a wide variety of modules? Well, to begin with, I had some mixed results. One of the GrooveBars was giving me rim triggers on the head zone with certain presets on my TD-50X, but the other one wasn't. I spent quite a while testing this, and then I got in touch with drum-tec to check that I hadn't overlooked something. It turns out that there was a problem with a particular batch which was causing this issue, and they promptly sent me a replacement. That's better. So when the triggers are functioning as they should be, there's some general behaviour that's the result of the trigger design and the positioning that you've picked, regardless of the module. Overall, the sensitivity of these triggers is good across the head, and there's great separation between the head and rim zones on the majority of modules. No matter where the trigger is located, there will be a hotspot if you hit directly on top of the cone. When used off-center, the hotspot isn't gone, it's just moved. One small downside of this on my 14-inch drum is that there's a bit of a drop-off in sensitivity as I get to the far side opposite the trigger. However, velocity curves can help with this. Both triggers also sometimes gave me small ghost triggers if I hit the rim softly in certain places, though it was more pronounced and repeatable on the 14-inch. It is refreshing though to get hold of a third-party trigger that starts in a good place on a number of modules. That said, there are still some things that do need adjusting, and some of the modules still have their quirks, so let's take a closer look. I began testing with the TD-50X, but all of this was the same on the TD-27 module running version 2 software. I used a small increase of the scan time and re-trigger cancel settings, as well as appropriate threshold adjustments to get rid of the mild double rim triggers. The positional sensing isn't perfect on my Roland modules. This is where I tried the 14-inch in the center position, and I did get slightly better results with this, but it's still a little bit shaky in some spots. When playing normally though, and not under a microscope, the positional detection does feel like it's generally doing what it should, and for all intents and purposes, it's the best head positional sensing that I've had with a third-party trigger on a Roland module. The rim's positional sensing, however, seems to act differently depending on the preset. Here's an example of how it should work with Roland's PD-128 pad. Unfortunately, I couldn't get similar results on either GrooveBar with the same preset. However, if I change to the PDA-140F preset, which has rim positional sensing but not head positional sensing, it works as it should. The cross-stick button mode, which you enable to swap between cross-stick and rim shots, doesn't rely on positional sensing, and that works exactly as it should. Personally, I think if you've got a TD-50X or 27 and you're happy with the Roland ecosystem, the digital snare just makes much more sense to use as your main snare rather than this trigger. On the flip side, as a tom or auxiliary snare, I think these triggers are fantastic, and the head, rim click and rim shot detection is great. On the TD-17 module running version 2 software, things are much simpler. Anything related to positional sensing and the digital pads doesn't apply, so you can get all available articulations easily. On the Pearl Mimic Pro, I began with the ATV snare preset. If you're not fussed about positional sensing, both of these triggers did dial in well on either a Roland PD-128 or PD-125 preset. I did need to bring up the mask time, re-trigger and threshold settings a bit to get rid of the false rim triggers, but this didn't affect performance once dialed out. On the 2-box DrumIt 5 Mark II, I used the appropriate pad PP settings for both. In order to get good rim triggering, I needed to use the X-Trig and X-Adjust settings, and increase the mask time of the rim zones, as I've needed to with many other pads. It took a bit more effort to get rid of the ghost triggers on the 14-inch pad. I did manage to dial them out by adjusting the threshold more on the rim zone, but this did have the compromise of stopping lower velocity notes from sounding. Overall, it still performed well, and I'd be happy to use these for the majority of my own playing. On the Alesis Strike, once I set the right sensitivity and velocity curves, the head response was great, with a little bit of expected hotspotting. Unfortunately, as I've come to expect from experience with other pads, the rim triggering was shaky on the Strike. Generally, I'd say just use Alesis pads with the Strike, they'll be more consistent, but if you really want different triggers, keep an eye out for my Groove review. On my eDRUMin 10, getting rid of the double rim triggers took a little bit more tinkering with the hold and decay times, but once I dialed that in, I could get a nice sensitive response with head, rim and rim shot detection on each trigger. So all round, the groove bars are great triggers that work well in most situations, though of course they're not without a few small downsides. Now the elephant in the room for me is the price. This is steep for a dual zone bar trigger with one cone. I do think that the build quality gives it a boost in value, but this price might be a barrier for entry, especially if your module can't make use of all of its potential features. However, if I knew that I wanted to do an acoustic conversion from scratch, I would probably consider these despite the price, because there's a fine balance between build quality, making the most of your module's features, and mounting a trigger to perform optimally. And in that respect, I do think that drum-tec have tried to cover as many of these bases as possible with their thoughtful design and great performance. If you want to know what I think of other drum triggers, I've got the playlist for you right here. Or if you're looking for great new sounds for your electronic drum module, including multi-layered instruments, check out my store over at the eDRUMworkshop.com. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!